Well, good day to everyone joining us and welcome to today's X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Holistic Measures of Physical Functioning in Cancer, New Opportunities with Digital Health Technologies. My name is Ryan Muse and I'll be your X-Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes, and this presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. Now, the webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit your questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you require any assistance along the way, you can contact me at any time by sending a message using the same chat panel. At this time, know that all participants are in listen-only mode, and please note that the event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank VivoSense, who developed the content for this presentation. VivoSense Inc. develops and validates real-world digital clinical measures and provides end-to-end services and solutions for their delivery in clinical trials. Their hypothesis-driven framework provides analytical and clinical validation, leading to FDA approval. VivoSense delivers novel digital biomarkers from wearable sensor data, which constitute primary and secondary clinical endpoints in regulated international pharmaceutical trials. VivoSense is dedicated to improving patient clinical research and care. I'd now like to introduce our speakers for today's event. Suvekshya Aryal is a research scientist at VivoSense, currently focusing on understanding patients' experience with cancer and its treatment and developing digital measures of physical functioning for integration into clinical trials. Suvu holds a master's degree in public health and epidemiology and extensive clinical research experience. Thomas Switzer is a principal scientist and the lead for digital health in Genentech's Research and Early Development Informatics Group. He focuses on developing technology platforms, supporting molecule teams across Genentech's early development portfolio. Tom has over 23 years of clinical development experience, including 9 years of experience in developing and deploying digital technologies in clinical trials. Dr. Teresa Coles is an assistant professor at Duke University School of Medicine's Department of Population Health Sciences. As a health outcomes methodologist, she specializes in measuring and evaluating patient-reported outcomes and other clinical outcomes assessments to aid decision-making in healthcare delivery and clinical research settings. Dr. Coles' research is centered on enhancing the assessment of physical function and related concepts, improving the interpretability of PRO scores, and designing and implementing screeners to improve patient-centered care. And Dr. Heather Leach, an associate professor and director of the Physical Activity for Treatment and Prevention Lab at Colorado State University, holds degrees in exercise science, physiology, and a PhD in kinesiology. She completed postdoctoral fellowship training in physical activity for cancer survivorship at the University of Calgary and holds certifications as a clinical exercise physiologist and cancer exercise trainer. With over 15 years of experience, she specializes in promoting exercise among clinical populations and teaching exercise science-related courses. Now, before we hear from our speakers today, we have a poll question for audience members. This should be appearing on everyone's screen right now, and you can participate by selecting on any of the answers that you see in front of you and then clicking submit. The question that we're asking is, which category best describes you or the industry that you represent? Your answer options are patient, technology provider, pharma, academic, or other, for example, CRO. In a moment, we'll continue to hear from our speakers today on their presentation, but first we have a question for you, which is which category best describes you or the industry that you represent? It looks like most of you have your answer in, so thank you so much for participating. Let's take a look at where your results have come in. We have 44% of you selecting technology provider, 31% for other, for example, a CRO, and then 13% for both pharma as well as academic. So thank you again very much for your participation. Without further ado, though, I'd like to hand the presentation over to our moderator for today's discussion. Suvu, you may begin when you're ready.
Great, thank you, Ryan, for the introduction, and welcome everyone to our webinar. discussing holistic measures of physical functioning in cancer. So I will briefly introduce our topic for today, and we will go on to our great list of panelists today who will share their perspectives from industry and academia. I want to begin by highlighting the immense burden of cancer and its treatment on patients' quality of life. We know that cancer and its treatments have severe impact on a patient's day-to-day functioning. And we know from patients that it is an important and meaningful aspect of health in their disease and treatment journey. FDA, the regulatory body, also recommends that physical functioning, in addition to symptoms and adverse events, is a core clinical outcome in cancer trials. So there are various methods of assessing physical functioning in research and practice, and some of these I've listed here. Essentially, there are patient-reported outcome assessments, which are surveys filled out by patients, clinical reported outcomes, and clinician-reported outcomes, and performance outcomes, which is essentially timing how far patients can walk in 6 minutes. And more recently, we have digital health technologies derived outcomes, essentially wearable devices that measure patients' step count and various other aspects of physical functioning. I just want to note here before we move on to the next slide, there is a rise of DHTs in clinical research since the advent of obviously the research-grade devices as well as commercial-grade devices, and we use them in our day-to-day life. But I just wanted to highlight that there have been utilization of DHTs only in exploratory outcomes so far in understanding physical behaviors, and I think there is now a need for a more systematic development and implementations in clinical settings. So I'll move on to my next slide. Thank you. Just as a recap of the existing methodologies of assessing physical functioning in cancer, we have patient-reported outcome, clinician-reported outcome assessment, performance outcome assessments. These assessment types have been widely used and accepted. However, they come with limitations like they are highly burdensome, they are subjective to biases, they're episodic, only capture a snapshot of patients' physical functioning. With the DHTs, we have potential to capture real-world physical behavior. We have the potential to address some of these limitations of existing assessment methodologies. We can do so by passively, remotely, continuously capturing physical functioning as the patients go about their day-to-day life in their lived environment. I just want to note that the benefits of DHTs have been realized by the DHT community, and there is now wider acceptance of its use. However, the DHT community of researchers, manufacturers, as well as now regulators unanimously agree that there is a need to define and optimize a set of core digital measures and address the unmet need in cancer. As a result of that, there are multiple ongoing efforts to accelerate the development efforts, and we at VivoSense are also very invested in this project. We'll go on to the next slide. Ultimately, the greatest need is in defining what a holistic assessment of physical functioning looks like. Essentially, there are self-reported assessment measuring perception of patients. There are performance measures assessing persons' maximal capacity, but then now we have the opportunity to also assess real-world physical behavior. While there are opportunities to integrate these measures into research and practice, evidence-based generation and development of outcome measures have been a major gap, and it is important that we discuss that today. For the FDA, there is no one optimal method of assessing physical functioning, and it is yet to be defined, and precisely because of lack of evidence or studies comparing and contrasting or integrating multiple methods of physical functioning. I will say that this is important to consider in patient-focused drug development recommended by the FDA, as it can play a major role in novel therapeutics. I'll go on to my next slide. So with all of that in mind, at VivoSense, we are committed to following the recommendations and guidelines provided by the FDA to provide patient-centric digital measures of physical functioning, and we want to incorporate that in clinical trials. We're doing that at VivoSense and currently engaging multiple stakeholders to do that. And the development effort essentially has three main phases. At first, we identify meaningful aspects of health in cancer and its treatment, and we do so by asking patients about their lived experiences through qualitative and quantitative studies. In the second phase, when we know what to measure, what concepts to measure, and what are important to patients, we want to do a real-world feasibility study, again, including patients. Finally, we conduct clinical and analytical validation study, which means that we understand whether these measures are reliably and accurately assessed, and they can detect change or predict outcomes in the presence of an intervention. So with this big picture goal in mind, our objective today was to gather experts in the field who are working directly with the patients or indirectly with the patients, working in research in their own field, and discuss various methods of capturing physical functioning in research and practice, and also discuss the ways we can improve them. So I will stop there. And we will continue with speaker's presentation. First, we have Tom Switzer from Genentech, who will present on industry perspective on use of digital health technologies in early clinical development and opportunities that lie there. Go ahead, Tom. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. I'll provide a little bit more background on how I look at these tools more broadly, as well as how we can look at leverage them specifically in kind of an oncology setting. Next slide, Ryan. I kind of wanted to present like a high-level overview. So looking at this slide here, the dark black line that kind of swirls there looks at the technology itself, and this can be a DHT, a wearable, something like that, plus what it actually is derived from it in terms of the measure. And I overlaid it with the blue line about how it fits into the stages of drug development, looking at the early stage where I spend most of my time, as well as how it sort of matures into late stage and even into commercial settings. Because we can take the data derived from these tools and we can use them in an early stage, we can use them in late stage as for primary endpoints, and we can use them even in an on-market setting to help physicians treat patients. Sorry, my phone's soothing. Where I spend most of my time in the early stage at Genentech, I work in the early clinical development. I kind of look at this more broadly across all of our diseases. About half of our portfolio is oncology, the other half is non-oncology, and I look at a little bit more from the technology side and matching it to the meaningful aspect of health, like what we want to measure and is technology suitable. In the early stage, we use the technologies really to help drive some insights. We can use them for the design of novel outcomes and biomarkers to match what's going on. We can use it to establish proof of concept and digital data analysis methods related to the technology itself. Does the technology measure what we want it to do? And then we can use this evidence base to looking at these more human factors. Do patients accept it? Is there good adherence? Does it correlate to clinical values? And can it actually help supplement our traditional endpoints? In the study itself, we usually position these as exploratory endpoints, and they generate the early evidence that we can go to regulators with to support inclusion as a secondary, or in some cases as primary endpoints later in development. But we have to build this evidence base early. Usually we find this the sweet spot kind of in the phase 2A space, where we've had some evidence of efficacy, and we can run it. We like to run it as optional sub-studies, where we'll do select sites with all patients at those sites. So it's not required for all patients, but it does give us enough data, and we can match it to clinical anchors with which to generate some of these measures. We're also looking at these to support molecule proof of activity. Does the molecule sort of treat to target or key symptoms, and in some cases help establish safety profiles of the molecules. As these move forward, this is when they become label enabling. So they can help support development in patient identification, segmentation, differentiation. They can help in risk mitigation. They can actually be included in the risk benefit analyses for inclusion or even on the label claim. And at this point in time, we're also looking at regulatory qualification of novel endpoints, and this is not a light lift. Some of you may be aware of the 95th percentile stride velocity endpoint that Roche developed. It was finally qualified as a primary in Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, and I think that took 7 years. And that's one of the first de novo novel endpoints derived from a wearable. Some of the ones we'll talk about, there are other ones that are derived from accelerometers. I think Suvi referred to the MVPA that Actigraph or Bellerophon had used in the pulmonary arterial hypertension study. So we're starting to see a few sort of emerge, but that's the result of many years worth of work. As I've mentioned, these can be positioned as primary endpoints, and if they are positioned, all patients have to be treated with it to show this treatment effect. And in an oncology setting, I think we're probably looking more at secondary endpoints, largely because oncology has well-established primary endpoints around tumor size as well as overall survival. But I think our sense is that these can provide some benefit in terms of the patient functioning, and the regulators are starting to demand this as well, looking at the patient more holistically. These same tools, as I mentioned, can move on into on-market or clinical setting if the drug gets approved and the technology is approved. It can be marketed as clinical decision support tools or software as a medical device, and these can support sort of on-market treatment to help physicians treat their patients. Again, my work is on this early thing, but other parts of my organization look at how this kind of flows, this whole kind of life cycle of the use of technology. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about the technology itself. As we've mentioned, some of you are familiar with these sort of modalities or platforms, and the one I'll call out kind of at the top end here is the use of accelerometers, which basically measure movement in 3 dimensions, and you can couple these with some other things to get positional awareness and such. From these, you can usually derive measurements of activity or function. Suvi referred to a couple of the endpoints that can be derived. These would be, in our case, more around efficacy, and again, any disease has a patient functional activity component. I think it again help people feel, function, or survive in the typical COA definition. It's certainly suitable for oncology. You can also derive other measures from the accelerometer. Falls is another one. It can be a safety one. And that can be applicable to all patients. Again, if there's weakness or something else that's derived from that. As well, if you're wearing the accelerometer for 24 hours, you can also measure sleep. And if you layer on some other sensors, you can get some other measures. Moving down the list, there's a number of other ones. You can use smartphones. You can use audio. There's an interest in audio for efficacy measures. Postoperative lung cancer is an interesting space for that. Patients cough. There was a recent AdCom with Merck's gefapixant. If you haven't listened to the recording, it's actually really informative of looking at a cough and a measure of chronic cough patients. And then a little bit further down, where I'm seeing a lot of the uptake in the oncology spaces around the safety and efficacy, looking at remote patient monitoring solutions really related to the cytokine release syndrome. Speaking of which, there's the Digital Medicine Society CRS sort of working group, which is kicking off, and I think it's even part of Cancer X as well. But the interesting thing is where you collect heart rate variability, temperature, pulse oxygenation, blood pressure, vitals kinetics, but a lot of these sensors that are being used also have accelerometers, which you can use to derive movement and sleep from that. And so the idea is, like, if you can collect this data, for instance, in your analytics plan, you can look at these sort of secondary measures there. From the oncology side, again, I see a little bit more interest in the safety side than in the efficacy side or from functional activities, but again, there's a paper that was published a couple of weeks ago that showed there's pretty broad usage of this. I think about 15,000 patients treated and such across the industry looking at it. So I'm hopeful that there's more kind of traction in this space here, specifically in the oncology patients. And so with that, I'm going to move on a little bit I'll hand it off to Teresa, who's going to walk us through a little bit of the importance of patient involvement in development of COAs and PROs and how we can sort of couple these.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Hi, everyone. My name is Teresa Coles, and as Ryan mentioned earlier, I'm a faculty member in the Department of Population Health Sciences. I'm also a core faculty member in the Center for Health Measurement, which is in the same department. Next slide, please. So I'm going to kind of touch on 3 topics today. The first is that I wanted to start with an analogy about the importance of patient engagement in clinical outcome assessment development. And then we're going to talk a little bit about my research related to physical functioning and patient-reported outcome measures. So we'll talk about some measures that are available to evaluate physical functioning in cancer and general populations, and then also what we learned from some qualitative research that we did in our PROPS research program on what is most important to patients about physical functioning. Next slide, please. All right, so first for the analogy. Recently at our house, we had this window right next to our kitchen table where every time I sat down to have my coffee in the morning, the light was just like hitting me directly in the eye. And it was so irritating. And we knew that we really needed to put up some blinds. So I don't know how many of you have actually measured windows to put up blinds, but it can be very confusing. And at the end of the day, what we want to do is we want to cover the light, right? And we want it to look good too. And at the end, so when I'm thinking about this as an analogy, I'm thinking about, are these blinds fit for purpose, right? All right, next slide, please. So when we're measuring these windows, there's always questions about, do we include the frame? Do we include the windowsill, which is like sometimes above or right below the frame? What we want is we want the blind that is long enough. So I think Brian just showed that one. And then we certainly want a blind that's wide enough. So in the instructions for blinds, Brian, can you go to the next slide, please? They are very precise. Okay, so we're getting down to less than 1/8 of an inch. And a lot of times they ask us to sort of add or subtract 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch from the actual window measurement to fit that blind so that they're fit for purpose and we don't have any sun coming through. But these instructions are very detailed. I pulled these from blinds.com and actually the page just scrolls and scrolls and scrolls. So it can be complicated. There's a lot of information to gather. Next slide, please. So what does all of this have to do with patient-focused drug development and looking at COAs? Well, I'm thinking about the window and the blinds as, for example, an outcome like physical functioning. And the instructions are actually the patients. The patients literally hold the keys to how best to measure particular outcomes in clinical trials. When we do qualitative research, when we conduct qualitative interviews, focus groups, or include patients as stakeholders in panels throughout our studies, we hear directly from them what terminology they're using. We can learn what's most important to them about particular outcomes. We can learn how those outcomes change over time, which tells us for patient-reported outcome measures what a recall period should be to capture that, that actual outcome, such as physical functioning in folks with cancer. So one of the things that we think about when we are choosing patient-reported outcome measures, let's say for physical functioning, is does that measure what is intended, right? So this also kind of goes back to the window analogy as well. Are we measuring what we think we're measuring, right? Because what we're trying to do is we're trying to measure the part of the window that's going to give us that full block of light. I have a daughter, and when she was a baby and she had to take naps in the afternoon, we tried so hard to make sure that light was not coming through because we knew that it was going to influence her nap, and the nap is all important, right? All right, so one other point I just want to make on this slide is FDA put out the patient-focused drug development guidance. We now have, I think, 4 guidances specifically related to patient-reported outcome measures and other COAs. And this guidance really highlights the importance of patient involvement to tell us about the patient experience. Next slide, please. Oh, and thank you, Ryan. Patients know what's important to them. So this kind of goes back to our instructions. Patients, when we speak with patients, when we do those qualitative interviews, we learn from patients what's most important to them. All right, so now let's transition to some of the work that we did at Duke within our PROPS research program. The first thing that we did was we conducted a targeted literature review to identify patient-reported outcome measures evaluating physical functioning in both adults diagnosed with cancer and also the general population. So we can use sometimes measures that are developed for the general population in specific disease populations. So in our study, we found 14 measures that were possible that evaluated physical functioning in these populations. And then we looked at sort of the similarities and differences among these measures. Next slide, please. One of the things that came out of this work is that physical functioning measures that are patient-reported actually measure some different facets or sub-concepts of physical functioning. So we see things like ability to complete activities, which is like a patient's capability to conduct an activity, completion of an activity, so whether or not somebody actually completed a set of activities, difficulty conducting an activity, so it's like how challenging was it for somebody to complete an activity, and then all the way down at the bottom we have satisfaction with conducting an activity, which is sort of like patients' contentment with the actual conducting of that activity. So with this work, this is based on some qualitative work that we did and work with a stakeholder panel that also included patients, industry representatives, FDA, other researchers, physical therapists, et cetera. It really sort of raised the question to us, well, what is most important to patients about physical functioning when we're thinking about the different ways we can evaluate physical functioning from a patient-reported outcome perspective? Next slide, please. So what we did was we conducted a relatively large qualitative study of 72 patients. 12 of them were inpatients. We wanted to capture people who had sort of limited physical functioning and had a really recent change in physical functioning, and then 60 outpatients. Very diverse group of individuals. And what we found is that the two most important aspects of physical functioning for individuals diagnosed with cancer were ability and satisfaction. So let's talk about these things. When patients thought about ability, they're thinking about ability to complete activities, not necessarily did they complete a particular activity or did they even try a particular activity. It's do they think that they can do it, right? Do they think that they can go up and down the stairs? Can they run a mile? Do they feel like they have the ability to bend down and pick up something heavy from the ground? So we have a quote here from a participant. It's the best description of what you can or cannot do. And then another sort of theme came out of this ability work, which is the idea of independence. So patients put, or some of the patients put a lot of weight into ability to do things for themselves. So thinking about, will they need assistance either from an assistive device or from other people to help them with particular activities? That is really key for how we measure physical functioning in cancer trials. Are we including the help that patients get or not when we're measuring physical functioning? And then the second most important thing to patients was satisfaction in conducting activities. And this makes sense, right? We have a quote here, if I'm happy or unhappy with the level of function is really the only important thing. So what we found is that it's sort of like regardless of where someone is on this level of physical functioning, they may have different levels of satisfaction. So from a measurement perspective, satisfaction is a very complicated thing to measure and put everybody on the same level. But yet we're hearing this is very important to patients. All right, so I'm going to hand it over to Heather Leach to talk about her research. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Teresa. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm Heather. I'm an associate professor at Colorado State University, and I'm in the Department of Health and Exercise Science. And the majority of my work has focused on physical activity programming and interventions for cancer survivors to improve things like physical function and patient-reported outcomes. So I'm hoping that my next few slides will be complementary to the two fantastic talks you just heard. perhaps highlighting some of the limitations in sort of the traditional way that we're measuring these outcomes in intervention work, but more hopeful that it'll highlight some of the opportunities for digital health technologies to integrate with our interventions, our programs, and complement some of the things that, that we're already doing. All right. So just a little bit of background for those of you who are not familiar sort of in the physical activity for cancer survivorship or exercise oncology space. We have a pretty good understanding of what works in terms of helping cancer patients, cancer survivors to increase their level of activity or to engage in exercise. So we know that supervised exercise interventions or programs are really effective. We bring them to a site, we bring them to a YMCA, whatever the case is. They're really effective at helping them engage in this behavior, but the main limitation of this is access, right? So these are very highly specialized programs with qualified trainers, and most of these studies and programs are conducted at either academic medical institutions, particularly if we're talking about clinical trials, clinical exercise trials, but even community-based programs tend to exist in larger cities and more affluent areas. So we do have some limitations in terms of access. Next slide, thank you. So, to overcome this limitation of access, a lot of people have sort of leaned into distance-based or remote approaches. So we have, lots of apps. So we use mHealth, websites, telephone coaching, lots of these remote or distance-based interventions. So, although these can overcome the limitations of access and even scalability of some of these programs, they tend to lack some really important elements of efficacious behavior change programs or interventions. And primarily, these are things like social support from other participants. We hear over and over again from our participants, this is one of the things that keeps them coming back to our exercise programs. The other is accountability, having a set time and knowing, a real life person is there waiting for you, expecting you to show up at the program or the intervention session, as well as, supervision and feedback from a qualified professional. Depending on where patients are in their course of treatment, sometimes engaging in exercise can be confusing. They're not sure what's safe, what's not safe, how to modify their exercise program. So having a qualified professional there in real time can be really helpful. So these are some of the things that we think and we've seen throughout the years are important for this population, but are missing from these distance-based approaches. All right, next slide. So, one sort of silver lining of the COVID pandemic was this exponential expansion of the use of telehealth or video conference technology. So, similar to many other people during this really uncertain time, we were sort of forced to transition all of our in-person physical activity interventions and programs to platforms like Zoom or Skype or Teams. So this actually allowed us to retain those really important elements of real-time supervision, accountability, and social support that were maybe lacking from some of the previously used distance-based approaches. So this is kind of what I'm going to focus on today, is our use of these video conference technologies to deliver our interventions and programs, and just give you a really basic overview of how we've measured some of these outcomes that we're interested in today. So I'll primarily talk about two different programs. So one is an outreach program called Fit Cancer that we've been running out of my lab for several years. And the other is a pilot randomized controlled trial for colorectal cancer survivors that was funded by the American Cancer Society. Next slide. So in general, as I mentioned, we're really big on delivering all of our sessions in a group-based format, led by an instructor, all delivered in real time. So in Fit Cancer, so this is an 8-week program. Everything we do in that program now is done remotely. So all of our assessments at pre-program and post-program are delivered remotely with one of my program staff via Zoom. For our randomized controlled trial with colorectal cancer survivors, this one we retained our assessment time points in person, so participants attended their baseline and post-intervention study visits in the laboratory. And you can see in the video there that this is kind of what a typical session looks like for our interventions and programs. So again, the instructor leads, we have an instructor that leads every movement. We have another instructor or program staff that kind of make sure everyone's doing what they're supposed to be doing. And if they need to jump in and pull someone in a breakout room, we want to make sure everyone is doing things safely and appropriately. But all of our sessions are done circuit style. We do a mix of aerobic and resistance training each session. Our goal is targeting both cardiovascular endurance and muscular strength and endurance, and then we do a little bit of balance, flexibility, again, depending on the participants and the goals of the program. So that's just kind of an overview of what these actual intervention sessions look like. Right, next slide. So as I mentioned, we assess all our outcomes at pre and post program or baseline and post intervention. And so a lot of this includes, primarily the outcome of interest of physical activity behavior change. So we want to see, are we engaging our participants in physical activity? Is it increasing over the course of the program or intervention? We also measure physical function and patient-reported outcomes. So for our remote assessment, so for our Fit Cancer program where everything is done remotely, we measured physical functions using tests like sit to stand, a brief balance test, and a bicep curl. So you can see a couple of those photos there. And again, all supervised in real time by a program staff. For a randomized controlled trial, for when participants would attend their study visits in person in the lab, we still did the same physical function assessments like sit to stand and balance and bicep curl, so more muscular and endurance, if you will, but we also included more laboratory-based assessments like a submaximal aerobic treadmill test. We did a 10 repetition maximum strength test for upper body and lower body. We also looked at body composition using DEXA scans. And then for patient-reported outcome, and again, this part's relatively easy to do remotely, measuring things like quality of life, fatigue using validated questionnaires. And, in general, I can say across the board, we've seen improvements using video conference technology in all of these outcomes. So in general, we see improvements from pre to post program or pre to post intervention in most of these metrics of physical function, as well as quality of life and fatigue. And many of these changes are comparable magnitude actually to our face-to-face programs and interventions. So again, really promising in terms of being able to scale up some of our face-to-face modalities, but still retain some of those important elements. Next slide. All right, so I think here's kind of the fun part and where I hope we'll segue into some really robust discussion and questions. So, as I mentioned, although we've had, a lot of success and seen a lot of positives in using this group-based video conference modality, there's still lots of opportunities, I think, to increase our impact using digital health technology. So one of these is really the time gap between baseline and post-program, right? So we sort of do these cross-sectional snapshots, right, at two different time points, but still cross-sectional of how people are feeling, what they're doing, what their function is like. But really, we have sort of this long gap in between, whether it's 8 weeks or 12 weeks, and we really don't have a great understanding in this intervention space about what people are doing during that time, other than the times that we're supervising them, right? When they show up to our intervention sessions, we know exactly what we're doing. We're watching them, we're monitoring them sometimes with heart rate monitors, we're asking about their rating of perceived exertion. But outside of that, hour twice a week, we're not totally sure, what they're doing in terms of physical activity behaviors and engaging in exercise. The second is really the trajectory of change in physical function patient-reported outcomes. And again, instead of sort of this 2 time point cross-sectional snapshot. And the other is in terms of impact. And again, this isn't specific to video conferencing. This is really, how do we make sure, and I think Teresa did a really nice job of talking about this, so hopefully I'm just reiterating this point, is, how do we really capture the impact of our physical activity interventions? What do our participants consider meaningful or important in terms of change, right? So this goes beyond calculating our statistical significance, and sometimes even goes beyond, you know, thinking about a meaningful clinical difference, right? An MCID, you know, what actually matters to our participants from our qualitative work. And we get this a lot, you know, our participants will say that the best thing for me following the program intervention was I was able to make my own tea again, right? I was able to lift the tea kettle and make my tea all by myself. And you know, we sometimes think, we're like, did we do a good job capturing this? Did our change in our physical function measure or a patient reported outcome really capture the impact of our interventions and programs? And I think, so I'm going to stop there. Next slide is just my contact information. So I'll stop there and hopefully have raised some exciting points that we can dive into in the question and answer. So thank you all.
Great, thank you, Heather, for the presentation. Thank you to all the speakers. I think that was really setting stage up for our panel discussion. We'll now move on to the panel discussion, and I invite all the speakers to just join me. I also want to remind the audience to, there are some questions, great questions coming in already, and I want to remind you that the chat box is open. You may enter questions that you'd like to ask the panel. I want to start by saying thank you to the panel for sharing their perspective. I know it's wonderful to hear from you all who are directly or indirectly working towards improving the lives of many patients in many ways. So I want to ask an open question to all the panel members. It's sort of a cross-disciplinary question. We talked a lot about holistic assessment of physical functioning and integrating, you know, DHTs, which are up and coming, and PROs, which are already well established and validated. They both have benefits and advantages. In integrating those measures, how do we better integrate them to enhance patient centricity in cancer treatment and care? So, you know, keeping in mind that we want to meaningfully do that and also incorporate them in research and practice. Or maybe we can start with Tom and go to Teresa and Heather.
No, it's an interesting, I'll take it in a couple of different ways. And one, I'll make a plug for a paper that's coming out that we looked at these as PROs as complementary constructs to DHTs. The idea is like a DHT can tell you how many steps, but it can't tell you about what the steps did. And so you can't get away. And one of the limitations I see kind of in current research is they're trying to use like DHT-derived data to predict a PRO score, and I don't think that's a good match. So the idea, I think, you know, so first and foremost, we need to get the DHTs into trials. And as I said, in oncology, it's in some functional spaces there. If we can get them into more where we've got robust clinical anchors that we can and ask these questions, both subjective and some DHT-derived data, I think that can give us a better holistic picture of patients. And I mean that applies for all kind of disease areas as well. But it's like the first things first, let's get them involved in trials. And that's something that we're trying to do a bit more. It's just the uptake has been slow. And I've mentioned earlier, it's like safety may be the place, but maybe we can get some accelerometry data where we can derive these measures of physical function, and then we can couple that with some PRO data as well in a way that integrates into an oncology clinical trial, which tends to be really complicated as it is, in a way that adds to it without actually getting a lot of, without adding a lot of patient burden to it.
Definitely. Go ahead, Teresa.
Sure. So building off of what Tom mentioned, for me, one of the things that came up in our research was patients who are sort of at the lower levels of physical functioning. And we think about qualitative recruitment, typically we're pulling in people who are able to participate in a 30-minute or 1-hour interview. So these are typically actually slightly healthier patients. One of the concerns that I have about patient-reported outcome measures is that sometimes we really only capture information from people who can answer the questions, who are able to do that. And so I'm wondering if DHTs offer an opportunity to us to capture physical functioning from patients who cannot participate.
And I think that's a great segue for Heather. I know you've worked with cancer survivors who come with different abilities and capacities, right? And I think the advantages of using DHTs is it's remote, and whatever kind of activities participants are involved in, you have a continuous assessment of that. Share your thoughts on that, please.
Absolutely. I think these are all really important points. And again, I think in exercise world, physical activity world, I think we have this limitation almost to a greater extent, right? Like the people who are coming to our exercise programs, interventions, and signing up for these trials tend to be on the higher end of physical functioning and health. So we do see a lot of ceiling effects, and we don't know, maybe we're underestimating the effects of some of these interventions and programs for improving the health of those who are starting at a much lower level. So I think, twofold, we're trying to do more where we're integrating these things into standard of care, right? Where we're working with programs that every cancer patient is referred to this. So we have less selection bias, which I think will help in some ways. But yeah, and again, another pervasive problem is just because someone didn't finish the program or didn't finish the intervention, and so we don't capture that time to, or that post-program, post-intervention time point, like there's so much going on in between that we're not capturing. And I think, these digital health technologies would be massive for moving the field forward.
Thank you. I think thinking about, let's say we've solved this problem, we have a holistic assessment, we have incorporated PROs and DHTs, and we know how to use them accurately and reliably. I wanted to get into what would be the challenges that will see in adoption in terms of in clinical settings, applying them in clinical trials, but also in treatment and care. Can we discuss some of the challenges that maybe we'll encounter when we implement them? Maybe we'll start.
Okay, I'll speak more on the clinical trial side, and since I'm not a physician, I can't speak to the care side of things. But on the trial side, again, and this may answer one of the questions in the audience as well, is like oncology trials are complicated. And the idea is, one of the biggest things is to insert it in a way that actually, that we can get data in a way that doesn't overburden the patients or the sites in this. And I think one of the things that we look at is, can we do better work on the front end part of putting into a trial? And I mean this by doing pilot work, by really understanding, and I always use, it's interesting, I do a lot of work with employees, like my coworkers basically, in designing these things. And I always use the rubric of, if it's hard for me to figure this out, it's going to be nearly impossible for a patient. And so really using this human-centric design and some methods of actually working with patients outside of our trials, so that we get the design right, we get the implementation right. You get it when you open the box, everything is paired, and all the person needs to do is put the watch on, and we look at the instructions, we work with our human factors engineers on the instructions, all of these sort of things, so that when we take a patient's time in a trial who is sick, we are being very mindful of what that time really is. And so I think we can do a better job on that front end and really understanding it, independent of the measure as well. And we have to validate the measure as well. But I think there's some really well-established measures of physical function that we could leverage as a starting point. Some of it is really on the operations and the logistics and kind of getting it in and realizing, understanding for us as pharma, like what kind of burden does this actually propose when you layer it onto an oncology trial where there's already a lot of stuff going on with people that are also dealing with being diagnosed with cancer. I think that's probably a place for, at least in the clinical trial side, to start. And I think, again, that may socialize it with some clinicians who really see the value in this, and maybe they'll implement it into more of their clinical practice. And I know some of our physicians also do a lot of work, and they can learn from this effort, and they can translate that over into more of the clinical care setting, and they can derive some value from some of these measures as well.
Thank you, Tom. I think you brought up a great point about creating value for patients so that there is successful implementation from the very beginning, right? And I want to ask this question to Teresa. Your work with patients, directly involving patients and engaging them in the development of COAs and PROs. And I wanted to, and that's, I think, a great way to create value, not just for developers or researchers or regulators, but also what are we providing for the patients. how do you think that work can translate into developing digital measures? Just as you discussed how you did that in PROs and COA's world, can we translate that to the digital measure development world?
Sure, thanks, Suvu. So I think that the qualitative work, so by the way, I do both qualitative and quantitative, but recently a lot of my work has been qualitative because I'm realizing just how important it is to get it right at the beginning, right? So in thinking about DHTs, some of the qualitative work that I think would be important to do up front are, one, like what is the outcome that we're trying to measure? How are patients experiencing whatever that is? Maybe it's physical functioning. How are they talking about it? What are their challenges? What is it about physical functioning that's most important to them? But then also kind of just even verbally testing out what is it about physical functioning that they're thinking about. So if we think about like accelerometry, any of these other ways of measuring physical functioning, are those things even like hitting or touching on what are those things that are important to patients? So that's one kind of opportunity in the qualitative work. And then another opportunity, kind of reflecting on what Tom mentioned, is this idea of sort of like usability. So if we think about the things that DHTs are sort of the challenges that they present, would be like, you know, do you need to be in an area where you have Wi-Fi? Do you have to log in to do this? Do you have to carry it around with you? How often might a digital thing need to be charged? And like frequency of data transmission. There's lots of things that patients might need to do or not do. And I think that there's an opportunity in the qualitative work to ask about the acceptability of that for patients.
Precisely, and I think I'll just highlight that that's the foundational work that we at VivoSense are doing, first understanding what is important to patients, and then when we know what to measure and we can measure them, we want to do we want to ask whether patients are willing and accepting to wear these devices to capture those outcomes, right? And I think this question maybe I can ask Heather, because you've worked directly with the patients and you provided DHTs in these exercise interventions. What are some of the challenges that you as a researcher and maybe patients also bring up when you hand over a DHT device, wearable device to them for a span of a few weeks to capture data, right? Are they willing and accepting of those devices to capture the things that we want to capture in research setting and maybe later on in treatment also?
That's a great question. And I think, you know, it depends on the device in my experience. You know, we've actually done one study where we had people wear a wrist-based device as well as a thigh-based device for several weeks, and then captured their both quantitative and qualitative perspectives of those wearables. And, you know, again, for some of them, you know, the wrist-based device had, you know, different barriers and discomforts than the thigh-based. So I think it depends on the device. And, you know, as a researcher, you go back to, well, which device should I use? And it depends on your research question. But in general, I think what's most helpful is really walking our participants through the use of those devices. You know, for the most part, they want to do a good job as a research participant. So we get a lot of questions about like, okay, if I take it off, what should I do? Where should I put it? You know, how do I store it? How do I make sure that I'm doing, you know, a good job as a research participant? So we've done everything from, you know, real time, like live video conference sessions with them to discuss how to use those devices. We have recorded videos, we have printed instructions. So we try to make sure they're equipped with all the information they need to feel comfortable using the devices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And I think the feasibility, understanding feasibility, real world usability, acceptability, that is also really important for us, and a lot of projects are underway that maybe in the future we can share with the audience. I really wanted to touch upon this patient centricity aspect that we discussed, maybe moving on to more clinical acceptance and regulatory acceptance. How do we ensure that DHT's derived outcomes are eventually utilized in clinical decision-making and regulatory decision-making? And Tom, maybe I can ask you this question and maybe you can share with the audience. How can researchers and developers effectively navigate regulatory landscape so that the tools that we develop are eventually utilized in clinical trials.
I mean, there's always the adage, engage early and often. And I mean, again, what we've seen with some of our work is, even before we went into phase 2A, getting some feedback from regulators on will they accept this as an endpoint, understanding what the validation is required of the system or platform you're using to derive this from, and proposing that upfront. And then having, as the molecule program moves forward, you provide sort of the data and the updates in there. And that, trying to, and I would say trying to put a non-validated instrument as a key endpoint in a phase 3 without any validation data is not going anywhere. You need to really do that in this early stage, either as natural history studies, or I mentioned phase 2A seems to be kind of the sweet spot in trials where we can actually collect real efficacy data. We can do it in a subset of patients, and so we can be mindful of where we go with this sort of thing and to help support it, but also to get a read from the regulators. Are they willing to accept this as data to support label claims? And you want to do that before you start your study so you can plan accordingly. That's what it is.
Thank you for sharing that. I think, yeah, early and often engaging regulators, engaging patients and key stakeholders. I think collaboration is really important here. I think we are going to take some audience questions here. We have a few more minutes for that. And maybe I can ask, there's a question about the ability and satisfaction that Teresa, that you presented earlier from the qualitative study. The question is, we can measure perhaps ability with the help of performance outcomes, but how do we then measure satisfaction? Can we use DHTs or maybe other types of assessment methods?
Yeah, so I think this is I don't know, I might even extend it to say a common issue. So we have outcomes that are important to patients, but then we have lots of different ways that we can measure these outcomes. So for physical functioning, for example, functioning in general, cognitive functioning, there's more than one way to measure that thing. Whereas if we look at pain, for example, it's usually just from the patient perspective. Physical functioning we can measure from the patient perspective, observer perspective, clinical perspective, performance measures, DHTs. So I think with satisfaction, I agree that it would be very challenging, if not impossible, to evaluate or assess satisfaction with a DHT. But that's okay, because it may not be the best way to measure that thing. And if we look back at the PFDD guidance, one of the ideas that they try to underscore is that we need to be able to provide evidence or a rationale that whatever it is that we're measuring, we are doing it in a particular way using some sort of COA, and this is the best way for us to evaluate that. So I think it would be a very rare circumstance in which we would put forward a DHT for something like satisfaction, but maybe we would put forward a patient-reported outcome measure for something like that.
Yes, thank you for answering that question. And we have only a couple more minutes. Maybe I can ask this last question about involving patients in development work and also handing out DHTs to patients. I wanted to bring up some of the ethical consideration and data privacy issues around that. What should we be concerned about? What should we prepare for, and how should we address those situations? Maybe I can start with Heather.
Do you mean from like a regulatory, like human subjects perspective, yeah. IRB?
Are patients to have the data captured continuously for a number of hours and weeks? And are there concerns that they bring up also?
From the patients? Definitely. Yeah, so I'll address it just from that standpoint. You know, obviously in our consent forms, we try to be as, transparent as possible about, what data we're collecting, is a GPS involved? Are we tracking them? So they have a lot of questions about what information we're collecting and then how we're using it. So I think, being really clear about that upfront, both in your consent form and when you're describing the study to a participant is really important. I think, for us, strictly with activity behaviors, I think because of how common, Fitbits and Garmin's, like everyone has these devices nowadays. So I think people are much more comfortable with those kinds of things when we say we're simply tracking your activity behaviors using, a gold standard device. Like those things are really, really easy and common. But I think as, you move towards adding additional things, whether it's GPS or PPG or sleep or something like that, I think people have more questions than simply the activity behaviors.
Great. Thank you. I think this was the last question that we could do. We're at time. We've come to the end of this webinar. I just wanted to say thank you to all the speakers for joining us today and sharing your perspectives. I think this is a great conversation, and hopefully we will continue these conversations among us. Maybe we have projects to collaborate on. VivoSense has a lot of projects upcoming in precisely these topics, and we hope to share the results in the next meetings. Thank you, audience, for all the questions that are coming in, and please follow up with us. We have our email addresses here. Hope to continue this conversation later on. I'll pass it to Ryan to close this out. Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much for that very insightful discussion. We have reached the end of our webinar today. If we couldn't attend to your questions, know that the team at VivoSense will follow up with you, or, of course, if you have further questions, you can direct them to the email addresses that are up on the screen. I want to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from X-Talks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen as you exit, and your participation is appreciated as it helps us to improve our webinars. Additionally, there's a link to view the recording of this event in the chat box, which you can also share with your colleagues so that they may register for the recording here as well. Now, please join me once more in thanking our speakers for their wonderful time here today. We hope that you found the webinar informative. Have a great day, everyone, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.